So I think we really did a great job with the last app. We addressed a lot of the core features of React, or at least some of the core syntax. We spoke about JSX, rendering lists, props, exporting code and requiring code, finally composition and nesting of components. It's really a lot of the core ideas behind React. So we answered a lot of questions in there, but there are also a lot of questions that we left unaddressed. For example, we are writing all this JavaScript, but what's happening to it that makes it pop up on our screen as a mobile app, as a native application? You can kind of juxtapose React Native with some of the other JavaScript frameworks out there intended for creating mobile applications like jQuery Mobile or Ionic Framework. Both of those output applications that are composed entirely of HTML components. So although it looks like an application, it's really running inside of a web browser. React Native, on the other hand, does not produce HTML. These are native views that we're working with here, native buttons, native text that shows up on the screen. So what is happening to the code that we're writing to make it actually show up on the page in that fashion? Well, to answer what's being done with that, let's look at a diagram that's here on the screen and try to get a better sense of what technology is handling what and how the code that we're writing gets translated into an actual application. Now, there's a lot of text on here, a lot of pieces, but we're going to walk through it step by step. So index.js on the top left here defines what we'll refer to as components, or sets of instructions on how to build a React widget. If you recall, our component had some tags in it like view and text inside of the JSX. Those two tags were like a blueprint that told React Native that we were about to define a component that contains some amount of text. Next is what I refer to as React Native JS, or the React code that we required into our application, into our index file. This is the side of React Native that understands how to translate the components that we're defining into a spec that is readable by the React Native renderer. Our code inside of index.js and React Native are ran through the React Native package manager. This packager is what's ran when we execute the command npm start. It's what takes all of our JavaScript inside of all these separate files and bundles them up all into one single file. It's also what takes those linkages, those require statements, and those module.export statements that we wrote, and make sure that all of those linkages occur appropriately to make sure that code from one file that gets required into another file is appropriately included in that little silo. Next is the Objective-C implementation of React Native, the library of code that knows how to interpret the JavaScript components that we defined in index.js and translates that into native iPhone widgets. This is where the text tag that we defined is translated into an actual iOS label that can be rendered onto the mobile device screen. The output of the React Native packager, which is a big single JavaScript file, is imported into our Weekdays Xcode project file. This is a whole bunch of Objective-C that takes the React Native library in addition to our code and bundles it all up into an application that can be deployed to a mobile device, which is what we see when we are looking at it inside the iPhone simulator. So again, this diagram is pretty simplistic and there are certainly additional complexities, but it definitely serves the purpose to describe generally what's happening with the code that we write. The most important takeaway here is that when we write our code inside of index.js, we need to keep in mind that we're writing a spec or a blueprint of sorts, a definition of how we want our application to behave. Then we rely upon React Native, all the different parts of it, to implement that specification as a mobile application. So with that in mind, let's continue into the next section where we're going to start our next application.